My birthday dinner turned into a celebration for my sister instead. Halfway through the meal, my father lifted his glass toward my sister, Elise, and said, with this proud little smile I'd seen my whole life, "This is what real ambition looks like." Elise laughed softly and added that teaching was the softer route, like it was a harmless observation. I sat there for a moment, reached for my coat, and said quietly, "Understood." My name is Lauren Whittaker. I'm 34. What my family didn't realize that night was that the moment they reduced my entire life to something softer, something smaller, was the exact moment I stopped trying to prove them wrong and started paying very close attention instead. The thing about that moment at dinner, the way my father said it so confidently, like it was obvious to everyone at the table, was that it didn't actually surprise me. Not really. Because that dynamic, Elise shining and the rest of us orbiting politely around it, had been in place for as long as I could remember. It wasn't loud or openly cruel. No one ever said, "Lauren matters less." It was quieter than that. Softer. The kind of imbalance that grows slowly enough that by the time you notice it, it already feels normal. My younger sister, Elise, had always been the family's rising star. Even when we were teenagers, my father, Thomas, treated her ambitions like they were national news. If Elise had a mock trial competition, my father was in the front row with a camera, leaning forward like the judge might call him to the stand next. He would retell her arguments afterward at dinner, word for word sometimes, laughing about how she had destroyed the opposing team. Meanwhile, I was usually the one asking if anyone wanted more salad. It wasn't that my parents ignored me. That would almost have been easier to understand. They just acknowledged my things quietly, politely, the way people respond when someone mentions a pleasant hobby. I noticed the difference most clearly when I finished graduate school. My hooding ceremony had taken place in a packed auditorium on a bright spring afternoon. I remember sitting there in that heavy black robe, holding the program in my lap, scanning the crowd every few minutes for my parents. I had saved them seats. 2 of them, right near the aisle. My father arrived halfway through. I saw him slipping down the row, checking his watch as he sat. He gave me a quick thumbs up from across the room when my name was called, the kind of small gesture people give when they're trying to be supportive but already halfway somewhere else. Later, he explained that Elise had a networking reception that evening with attorneys from the firm she was hoping to join. He didn't say it like an apology, more like logistics. Timing had just been complicated. He left before the ceremony ended. At the time, I told myself it made sense. Elise was starting her career. Those events mattered. Connections mattered. Law was competitive. Teaching well. Teaching was good work, meaningful work, but in my parents' world, it didn't carry the same electricity. Over the years, that pattern kept repeating itself in ways that were small enough to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore collectively. When Elise closed a major case during her early years at the firm, my parents hosted a catered dinner at their house. White tablecloths, wine from my father's special shelf, neighbors stopping by to congratulate her. My mother, Meredith, had printed out a framed article about the case and placed it near the entryway like a centerpiece. That same week, I had secured a district-wide literacy grant for my school, funding that would provide new curriculum materials for hundreds of students. I mentioned it during the dinner, while everyone was gathered around the table. My father nodded and said that sounded really nice. Then someone asked Elise about the judge in her case, and the conversation shifted back to her within seconds. No one meant for it to feel like a hierarchy. But after a while, you start recognizing the rhythm of it. The way certain accomplishments stop a room and others pass through it quietly, like background music people barely notice. And by the time my 34th birthday arrived, that rhythm was so familiar that I could practically predict how any celebration involving both of us would unfold. A few weeks after my birthday, I opened my inbox one Monday morning and froze. There it was, the subject line glowing from the screen. "Congratulations, National Excellence in Education Award finalist." I didn't even want to click it at first, afraid that the message might disappear if I breathed too hard. But I did. I stared at the email as though it might rearrange itself into a mistake. Wasn't a mistake. I had been selected as one of 4 finalists for the 2025 National Excellence in Education Award. The ceremony would be held at a major cultural center in Chicago, streamed live on the Public Affairs Network, and presented by the U.S. Secretary of Education. Travel, accommodations, the whole itinerary, it was fully covered. They even mentioned there would be cameras, a professional photographer, and a segment profiling each finalist on national television. My chest tightened. This was enormous. I sat back in my chair and just watched the cursor blink at the top of the email, imagining my parents' reactions, or rather, anticipating them. I'd been here before in different ways. Small accolades brushed aside, big milestones overshadowed. My mind flicked through dozens of dinners, dozens of conversations where Elise's achievements had been celebrated like family jewels, while mine were gently acknowledged and tucked away. I didn't want to tell anyone yet. Part of me thought, maybe if I just let it sit, the excitement would find its own way to me without the complicated weight of family judgment. But the practical side of me knew I had to inform them. After all, they were my parents, and this was significant by any normal standard. I opened the family group chat. The cursor hovered over the text field as if the act of typing could somehow influence the outcome. I drafted the message slowly, deliberately, short, factual, no flourish, no plea for attention. Just the essentials, my nomination, the ceremony, the broadcast, and the dates. I attached the official invitation as a PDF. I reread it. Then I reread it again. I tried to imagine the room when they read it. Would they pause? Would they say anything at all? Finally, I hit send. Within the hour, my phone started lighting up. My father's response arrived first, terse, dismissive, skeptical. Not flying across the country for a teaching certificate, it read. My fingers tightened around the phone. I felt that familiar twist of disappointment in my stomach, the one that had been there for decades, but this time it was tempered by a quiet resolve. I wasn't looking for validation. I was just informing. Elise replied next. Lighthearted, flippant. She had a client dinner that night and couldn't cancel. Her tone carried a kind of breezy superiority that felt both familiar and infuriating, the same undertone that had undercut my own celebrations for years. My mother didn't respond at all, not in the group chat, not in any other way I could see. I later learned she had sent Elise a private message, praising her case win from the previous week. I stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering over the home button, and felt an odd mixture of hurt and clarity. I could predict their priorities, their reactions, the way they would minimize significance and amplify everything else. And now I could choose how much weight to give it. I put the phone down, I exhaled, and I allowed myself, just for a moment, to imagine what it would feel like if the world outside my family's living room, if even a small part of it, recognized what I had done, without me having to argue, explain, or justify. I remember reading my father's reply again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Not flying across the country for a teaching certificate, he had written. The words were clipped, almost casual, but the dismissal was loud in the silence that followed. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, thinking about all the ceremonies he had skipped, the milestones he had prioritized Elise over me, and yet, somehow, this still stung. Then came Elise's response. Light breezy. Oh, Lauren, Grant, and I have a client dinner that night. Couldn't cancel, unfortunately. She punctuated it with an emoji, the kind you use when everything is fine and you know it, and you want everyone else to feel that too. I stared at it longer than I intended, the tension coiling in my chest like a small, familiar storm. Elise had always had this way of turning her world into a set of inevitabilities. And my achievements, anything that required more than a polite nod, were always optional. My mother didn't respond in the group chat at all, not a single acknowledgement. I double-checked my phone over the next few hours, half expecting a missed message, a delayed, so proud of you, anything. Nothing. Later, I found out she had privately messaged Elise, congratulating her on the win from her big case that same week. It wasn't even the award that had earned recognition. It was Elise's success at the firm, yet again, that got her mother's words, her attention, her pride. Sitting there with the phone in my lap, I felt that old ache, the one I'd carried quietly for decades. But something was different this time. It wasn't raw hurt. It was a measured, steady kind of understanding. I realized slowly that persuasion would be pointless. Any attempt to make them see the magnitude of this nomination, to explain what it meant, to insist that it wasn't just a certificate, would land on deaf ears. Their priorities were fixed, their sense of what counted for admiration already written, and I could spend my entire life trying to rewrite it for them and still never win. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and ran a hand through my hair. There was a brief sting, a whisper of frustration, but it was contained, manageable. For years, I had been trying to measure my worth by their acknowledgement, trying to fold myself into a mold that was never meant for me. Now, with that small but undeniable clarity, I felt a quiet defiance begin to bloom, not loud, not public, just a private realignment. I could acknowledge their dismissiveness and still move forward. I could let them be wrong without me feeling smaller for it. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was the start of something I hadn't felt in a long time, control over my own story. I realized I didn't need their validation. And for the first time, I understood that I didn't even need to convince them that I deserved it. I folded my hands over my lap, breathed slowly, and let the room settle around me. The dismissal hung in the air, but it no longer defined the edges of my world. The phone rang the next morning, and when I saw my grandmother's name, Eleanor Hayes, light up the screen, I felt a warmth that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I answered before the second ring, my voice careful but soft. "Lauren," she said, her tone carrying that unmistakable mix of authority and affection. "I just heard about the nomination." There was a pause, then a gentle laugh that sounded almost conspiratorial. "I had a hand in this, months ago. I submitted your nomination. I didn't tell anyone because, well, you'd never let me live it down if you knew." I blinked. My throat felt tight. I hadn't expected anyone in my family to truly see me, let alone take action on my behalf. And yet here she was, Eleanor Hayes, the retired school superintendent whose name still carried serious weight in education circles, who had overseen dozens of districts and mentored countless principals, telling me that she believed in me enough to act quietly and decisively. I don't even know what to say," I admitted, my voice faltering slightly. I could feel the old ache in my chest, but it was tempered now by something steadier. Recognition, validation, grounding. For the first time in years, someone I respected more than anyone in my family had taken the measure of my work and acted on it without prompting. "You don't have to say anything," she replied, and there was a faint crackle of a smile in her tone. "Your students have already done all the talking. I just made sure someone else noticed it too. You've built something remarkable, Lauren, whether your parents see it or not." I let the words sink in, and a quiet calm spread through me. The sting from my family's dismissal the night before, the ache of Elise's flippant reply, my mother's silence, all of it started to fade against the warmth of her confidence. For once, the validation wasn't conditional or performative. It wasn't about prestige in the eyes of others. It was real, grounded, and unshakable. "I thank you," I finally managed, voice steadier now. "I didn't expect anyone to do this, to notice." "Lauren, I noticed," she said simply. "I've been noticing for a long time." There was a pause on the line, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carries respect, the weight of a shared understanding. I could imagine her sitting in her study, hands folded over a pile of papers, watching my career quietly from afar, tracking my impact without needing anyone else to applaud. That call, brief as it was, grounded me in a way my parents never had. I felt a kind of quiet reassurance, an invisible anchor holding me steady in the storm of familial indifference. It reminded me that the work itself mattered. The people I touched, the students I helped, the lives I influenced, that was real. And finally, someone had seen it. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe. Not with relief, not yet with triumph, but with the calm certainty that at least one person in my life truly understood the value of what I had built. A few nights later, I found myself at the usual upscale restaurant, where my parents insisted on celebrating Elise's latest milestone. The warm lighting reflected off the polished wood tables, the soft clink of silverware punctuating the hum of chatter, and there they were. My father, glass in hand, recounting the details of Elise's newest case like it was a national headline. My mother, smiling and nodding, hanging on every word. Elise herself, radiant and self-assured, regaling a nearby table with anecdotes from her office. I slipped into the booth quietly, feeling the familiar undercurrent of tension that had accompanied every family gathering where Elise's achievements were the centerpiece. I waited for a lull in the conversation, when my voice wouldn't disrupt the rhythm of their celebration, and mentioned it casually, almost as an afterthought. "So, the ceremony in Chicago," I said, letting the words roll out in a neutral tone. "It's first class, nationally broadcast. The Secretary of Education is presenting." For a heartbeat, the table went silent, not a long silence, but enough for the air to feel suddenly heavier. My father paused mid-sip, his hand tightening slightly around his glass. My mother's fork hovered above her plate, her eyes flicking toward me with a mix of curiosity and, if I read it correctly, sudden recognition. Elise tilted her head, frowning slightly, as if parsing how to respond. I watched the subtle shifts carefully. For years, I had learned to read these small cracks, these tiny windows where their carefully constructed composure faltered. The pause was brief, but it was a shift, a momentary acknowledgement that this was bigger than they had assumed. "First class?" my father asked, voice even, but there was something in the cadence that suggested disbelief. "With the secretary, broadcast." "Yes," I replied simply, not raising my voice, not embellishing, not pleading. I let the weight of the facts carry themselves. "They've arranged travel and accommodations. Everything is covered." My mother leaned back slightly, her brow knitting as if she was recalculating something. Elise, ever quick to reestablish control, opened her mouth, paused, and then let the thought pass. My words hung in the air like a small challenge, undeniable but unprovocative. I could feel the subtle ripple of tension. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Their prior assumptions, that this would be just another minor accolade, easily minimized, had been disrupted. And yet, despite their recalibration, despite the flicker of uncertainty that crossed their faces, I made my decision in that instant. I wouldn't wait for them. I wouldn't ask for validation, argue for recognition, or insist that they attend. I had already seen the truth of what this recognition meant through my own eyes, and through the one person who had truly acknowledged it. Their presence or absence was irrelevant. So I stayed quiet after that, letting the conversation drift back to Elise, letting the restaurant's atmosphere return to normal. I smiled politely, raised my glass in the small, private acknowledgement of my own achievement, and quietly resolved that this time I would walk my path alone, if that was what it took. By the end of the evening, I knew I had made a choice I had never made before. To honor my own accomplishments on my terms, without seeking permission, approval, or applause from the people who had spent a lifetime underestimating them. A few days after that dinner, my phone rang with a number I didn't immediately recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me swipe to answer. On the other end was a producer from National News Network. "Hi, Lauren Whitaker?" she asked, her voice brisk but friendly. "We'd like to do a short segment about your classroom and your recent nomination for the National Excellence in Education Award. Are you available for a brief interview?" I sank back into my chair, suddenly aware of the quiet apartment around me. The city hummed faintly through the window, the usual rhythm of life continuing outside, completely indifferent to the surge of recognition waiting to unfold. My heart raced just slightly, not from excitement, but from the weight of what this meant. This wasn't a polite nod or a quiet letter tucked away in a pile of mail. This was national television, a platform where the world could see the work I had done, without the filters or diminishment I'd endured at home. And then it hit me, clearly, calmly, decisively. I wouldn't tell them anything else. Not a word, not a hint. My father had already dismissed the first notice as a teaching certificate. Elise had shrugged it off with a client dinner. My mother hadn't even acknowledged it. There was no space left for persuasion, no room for their recognition to matter, not when I could choose a different path entirely. I imagined them in Boston, continuing with their lives, planning dinners, discussing law cases, catching up on Elise's firm gossip. If they learned about the interview, it would come like a whisper from the outside world, the same way everyone else would discover it, through news alerts, notifications, perhaps even social media. And that was exactly how I wanted it. They didn't need a personal briefing. They didn't deserve a seat at the center of my moment. I scheduled the interview, taking meticulous notes about camera angles, lighting, and the key points I wanted to highlight. I practiced answers quietly in my living room, feeling the usual nervousness that comes with public speaking, but also a strange exhilaration. For the first time in my life, I was preparing for a recognition that was entirely mine, not filtered, edited, or diminished by someone else's priorities. Sitting there with the phone tucked beside me, I felt a weight lift subtly from my shoulders. For decades, I had measured every success, every accomplishment against a backdrop of familial indifference. And now, with a national platform, I could let the work speak for itself. No explanations required, no justifications necessary. If they wanted to notice, they would. If they didn't, it wouldn't matter. I looked out the window at the city lights stretching into the night, each one small and steady, and for the first time in years, I felt that same quiet steadiness in myself. The world would see, and I wouldn't have to argue for it. I didn't need to convince them, I only needed to show up, and everything else would follow. And just like that, I made a decision that settled deep in my chest. From here on, the recognition would arrive on my terms, and they would learn about it exactly as everyone else did. A week later, I learned through the quiet hum of city grapevines how Elise had handled my nomination in her own circles. She had met a few colleagues for lunch at a sleek downtown bistro, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows and a menu designed to impress without taxing conversation. From what I heard later, she laughed easily over salad and coffee, telling the table about the teacher award like it was a charming anecdote, the kind you tell when the punchline isn't supposed to sting anyone seriously. "Lauren's big event?" she said, grinning and shaking her head. "Oh, that's cute. Really, it's just a symbolic teacher appreciation thing, the easier path." She waved her hand as though dismissing something trivial, a paper plane flicked lightly across her casual tone. The table chuckled, not maliciously, but caught up in her charm, echoing the dismissive undercurrent she projected. What made the story stick wasn't the laughter. It was who had been there to listen. Caroline Reed, an attorney who had previously worked as an education reporter before joining Elise's firm, remembered every word. Caroline was quiet at the table, nodding politely, but the subtle tension in her expression betrayed the mental notes she was taking. She didn't interrupt or correct Elise, didn't challenge the casual minimization of a national accolade. She simply registered it, the small microaggressions, the easy dismissal, the laughter that coated judgment in social grace. The words lingered in Caroline's mind, as I would later learn, because they weren't just casual remarks. They were statements that betrayed a worldview, one that measured people against an arbitrary standard of prestige, overlooking impact entirely. Elise's joke was casual, yes, almost flippant, but it carried with it the weight of a lifetime of comparisons she had internalized and perfected. Teaching was respectable, but it was soft. Achievements that didn't come with a high-profile job title weren't worth pausing for. Meanwhile, I felt a strange mixture of detachment and satisfaction knowing this. Detachment because I wasn't there, wasn't required to witness the subtle dismissal firsthand. Satisfaction because the world outside my family was beginning to notice, and quietly, others were cataloging the truth I already lived. Caroline's ears, sharp from her journalism days, were catching threads my parents would never hear. And in that, I found a quiet reassurance that my story, the real one, was still being seen, even if Elise treated it as trivial. I could almost picture it. The conversation flowing, Elise laughing, the ease with which she had reduced something monumental into a punchline, Caroline leaning back in her chair, mentally filing the details, her expression carefully unreadable. And through it all, I felt the familiar pulse of vindication. Not loud, not showy, but a subtle, controlled satisfaction that someone outside the family understood exactly what I had accomplished. It was a reminder that recognition doesn't always come immediately or from expected quarters. That impact can be quietly measured even when dismissed by those closest to you. Elise thought she had the last laugh in her polished, social way, but there were observers, quietly taking note, and the stage for what was coming next was already quietly set. The morning of the ceremony, I stood backstage at the Cultural Center in Chicago, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and faintly perfumed attendees. I could hear the low hum of hundreds of voices, microphones being tested, and the occasional camera click. The room felt electric, a mix of nerves and anticipation vibrating in everyone's posture. I clutched my notes loosely, letting my eyes drift over the mass of educators, administrators, and media personnel who, like me, were waiting for a name to be called. I spotted my grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, in the front row of the audience, her posture straight, eyes sharp, and expression one of quiet pride. She gave me a small nod when our eyes met, a gesture that carried more weight than any familial praise I had ever known. It grounded me, reminded me why I was there and who had truly seen the work I had dedicated my life to. Then the moment came. The Secretary of Education approached the podium, a hush falling over the vast hall. I felt my pulse sharpen as the formalities concluded, and my name was announced. The 2025 National Excellence in Education Award goes to Lauren Whitaker. The words echoed around me, surreal and immediate, and I could feel every head in the audience pivoting toward the stage. My breath caught for just a second, a spike of disbelief mixing with a calm certainty that this recognition was deserved. I stepped forward, my heels clicking lightly against the polished floor, scanning the faces in the crowd. Cameras captured my movement, and for the first time, my accomplishments were visible to a wider world. The secretary began the speech highlighting measurable impact, improvements in literacy scores across the district, mentorship programs I had implemented, and former students who had gone on to serve their communities. Each metric, each anecdote, felt like a silent acknowledgement that the work I had done mattered, fully, completely, without any need for explanation or qualification. I listened as Daniel Ruiz, one of my former students, came on stage. He spoke with a clarity that tugged at the edges of my composure. He recalled how I had noticed him when no one else did, stayed late to help with scholarship applications, and celebrated even the smallest victories alongside him. "Those small, boring things," he said, "changed the direction of my life. She taught me that being seen matters." I felt a lump rise in my throat, my hands tightening briefly around the award folder, not out of surprise, but out of the validation that finally, here, someone outside my family fully grasped the depth of impact behind my years of quiet effort. Around me, the cameras captured each expression, each clap, the murmur of recognition rippling through the room. The scale of it, the national broadcast, the thousands of viewers, the acknowledgement from leaders in education, felt staggering, and yet it was deeply personal. For once, my work wasn't footnoted, minimized, or framed against someone else's achievements. Every lesson plan, every student meeting, every long night spent grading essays had led to this exact moment, and the world, in a very literal sense, was watching. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight and clarity settle around me. This ceremony was more than an award. It was a reckoning, a formal acknowledgement of the quiet dedication that had often gone unseen. And in that realization, I felt a steady calm, not triumph, not gloating, just the solid, grounding knowledge that my work had always mattered, whether anyone at home understood it or not. I watched from the stage as Daniel Ruiz walked to the microphone, his posture a careful mix of confidence and humility. He was one of those students you remember long after they've left your classroom, not because he was always the top of the class, but because he carried an uncertainty that no one else seemed to notice. And somehow, I had. Somehow, I had always seen him. He began speaking, his voice steady but with a tremor that betrayed the emotion behind the words. "I first met Ms. Whitaker in my sophomore year," he said, glancing briefly in my direction. "No one else really paid attention to me. I was quiet, struggling with reading, and honestly, I felt invisible." The room was silent. The weight of his admission hung between us, heavy and immediate. Daniel described the small moments, the afternoons I stayed behind after school helping him parse complex texts, the handwritten notes I left on his essays, the encouragement I offered when scholarship applications seemed impossible. "She never treated me like a number or a problem," he said. "She made me feel like I mattered. Those small, boring things, they changed the direction of my life." I felt a lump in my throat, my hands tightening briefly around the edge of the podium. I had taught hundreds of students over the years, and yet hearing him articulate the ripple effect of those small actions made it feel tangible in a way I'd never allowed myself to imagine before. Each word he spoke reminded me why I had spent years pushing through long nights, budget cuts, and constant doubt, not from anyone else, but from my own family's indifference. His testimony built momentum, each anecdote layering over the last. He recounted the time I had noticed his aptitude for writing, even when his confidence faltered, the way I had coached him through presentations he feared he would fail, the nights we stayed late to ensure his applications for summer programs were polished and competitive. "I don't think she even realized the full impact she had," he added softly, almost as if afraid to claim too much. Around the room, I could see heads nodding, a few faces dampened with tears. People were listening, not just hearing, but really listening. And in that moment, I felt a profound shift. The work I had labored over quietly, the countless unseen hours, the tiny victories that had never earned applause at home, were now being recognized in a way that words in a family group chat never could have captured. I exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering disbelief settling into my chest. It was intimate yet public, personal yet shared across a stage, a broadcast, and thousands of unseen viewers. Daniel's voice, strong yet tender, carried through the auditorium. Ms. Whittaker taught me that being seen matters. That someone noticing you, really noticing you, can change your life. For a long moment, I simply stood there, letting the gravity of his words wash over me. I didn't smile, didn't reach for applause. My eyes were fixed on the impact itself, on the life I had touched in ways my family had never bothered to acknowledge. And for the first time in years, the quiet validation from someone who truly understood eclipsed the absence of recognition I had grown accustomed to. The restaurant in Boston buzzed with its usual mid-afternoon din, clinking silverware and soft murmurs punctuating the warm hum of conversation. Then the first phones vibrated, an insistent chorus that drew startled glances across the tables. One by one, diners began checking screens, faces shifting from casual interest to disbelief. The television mounted above the bar flickered to a breaking news banner. National Excellence in Education Award winner announced, Lauren Whittaker recognized for literacy impact. Whispers rippled outward. A nearby couple leaned over, murmuring, "Wait, that's the Whittaker family, isn't it?" A few heads turned toward a group at a corner booth, eyes narrowing with recognition, curiosity, and a pinch of scandalous intrigue. "Why aren't they in Chicago?" someone asked, voice loud enough to carry, drawing attention from a half-dozen tables. The question, seemingly casual, hung in the air like a challenge. Elise, sitting across from our parents, instinctively pulled out her phone. Within moments, she had posted a message on social media. "So proud of our family supporting Lauren today. Family first, proud sisters," an attempt to reclaim the narrative, to portray unity where none existed. But before she could even finish her glass of water, a sharp ping indicated a reply from Caroline Reed. Caroline's post was short, pointed, and impossible to ignore. "Funny, no one in this family showed up. Recognition earned alone, not from photos of us pretending to care." The digital line crackled with tension, her words slicing through Elise's carefully constructed image of family solidarity. Screens around the restaurant blinked with updates, retweets, and comments amplifying the contrast, the truth in public view versus the staged narrative Elise had tried to control. Elise's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the growing flood of responses. Each new notification chipped away at the composure she had maintained through years of careful ambition. Her attempt to frame herself and our parents as supportive spectators collapsed under the weight of the evidence and Caroline's clarity. People at nearby tables whispered, pointing discreetly, connecting the online contradiction with the family seated before them. The Whittakers' name carried history, and the story now had a sharp edge, the kind that drew attention from beyond the restaurant. By the time the phones had settled, another alert pinged. Elise's office had been contacted. A terse message from firm leadership flagged reputational concerns, noting the public backlash and hinting at the professional consequences of misrepresenting support or attempting to spin a narrative. Elise's carefully maintained authority wavered under the scrutiny. The boundaries between private life and public image had dissolved in real time, and there was no hiding from the spotlight that had found her. I watched silently, the corner of my lips twitching with a faint, controlled satisfaction. Years of dismissals, the jokes about easier paths, the family's habitual disregard now exposed, filtered through social proof and public testimony. No confrontation, no argument, only the undeniable visibility of truth unfolding in live broadcast, social media, and the incredulous eyes of our own family, scattered among other diners. The moment was quiet yet devastating, a reckoning that required no dramatic gestures, only observation. From where I sat, it was almost cinematic. Elise's tension, the phones vibrating, Caroline's posts cutting sharply through the narrative, and the subtle ripple of recognition and gossip radiating outward. The event had become larger than her control, larger than her careful image of family support, and the world, every observer, every comment, every news headline had stepped in to fill the void she had left unguarded. I spent those first days after the ceremony tucked away in Chicago with Grandma Aliner, deliberately letting calls from home go unanswered. Her small apartment smelled faintly of old books and lavender, grounding me in something steady, something real. Outside, the city pulsed with energy, and inside, I felt the weight of the last year lift just enough to breathe. Invitations arrived in the mail, speaking engagements in New York and Boston, grants acknowledging literacy programs I had long dreamed of expanding. The townhouse we'd quietly secured felt less like a symbol and more like a safe harbor, space to think, to act, to finally inhabit the life I'd earned without explanation. Months later, the encounter with my parents was inevitable. I arranged it carefully, choosing the neutral cafe where their expectations wouldn't dominate the room. Father arrived first, the crease of age and concern lining his forehead, hands clutching a folded sheet of paper that smelled faintly of ink and eraser dust. My mother hovered behind, uncertain, as if trying to gauge whether I'd softened or remained untouchable. I didn't answer calls or texts in advance. I held the power in my timing. Father slid the note across the table. In his precise handwriting, the words carried an awkward gravity. "Lauren, I am sorry for what I failed to see, for what I ignored, and for what I assumed about your path. I hope you can forgive my blindness." No dramatics, no excuses, just the weight of recognition, inked by hand, tangible. I read it slowly, letting each word settle, noting how it was phrased to acknowledge failure without demanding response. I chose when to respond, if ever. Silence itself became part of the message, control reclaimed, dignity preserved. The balance had shifted quietly, irrevocably. I could feel it in the way they avoided my gaze afterward, the careful politeness that had replaced years of habitual disregard. My life had expanded without their validation. The grant announcements, the invitations to speak, the recognition from peers who had seen my work. Every public nod reinforced the private truth. I now lived without compromise. Sitting back, I allowed a subtle smile, not triumphant, but steady, the kind born from endurance, persistence, and finally being seen on my own terms. Grandma Alina reached over, squeezing my hand, a silent acknowledgement that what mattered most had been witnessed long before the world took note. I let the moment settle, unhurried, complete. If you found this story compelling, hit like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice.